So good afternoon. Welcome to May's Life, hosted by Mays and Associates. I am Catherine Yuan, one of the partners at Mays and Associates. I will be your moderator for this class. Many of you have already known about our firm, but if you don't, Mays and Associates is a full-service CPA firm offering services in accounting, auditing, information technology, and tax. I am going to go over a few housekeeping items before I turn over the screen to our speaker today. First of all, if you are encountering any difficulties in using Zoom, please use the chat function to get help. You should have received through email this morning a copy of the PowerPoint that will be used for this presentation. If you have not received one yet, please put your email address in the chat function and we will send you a copy. During the presentation, if you have questions for the speaker, you can either type your questions using the Q&A function, which is a box that you see on your screen, or you can raise your hand. If you raise your hand, please wait for us to unmute you so that you can ask your question in person. Please keep in mind that this session is being recorded, so if you prefer to stay anonymous, you may want to ask your question anonymously using the Q&A function. There are 6 polling questions during this presentation. In order to get CPE credits for this class, please answer the polling questions. Whether or not you get the correct answers do not affect your CPE credits. If for any reasons you cannot answer the polling questions or you cannot see them, you can, we are going to announce when the polling questions come onto the screen. If you do not see them or you cannot click on the answer, please just put your answer on the chat function and we will mark it down and we will still give you the credit. When you exit the class today from Zoom, at the end of this class, it will redirect you to a survey. Please fill out the survey so that we can send you your CPE certificate. The recording of this class will be available soon. By the end of this week, we will send you an email containing the links to all the recordings of 6 of our classes this week. However, CPE credits will not be given out when you view the recordings. Now with that, I would like to introduce you to our speaker today, Russ Bronson. Russ is the founder of Russ Bronson Consulting. Russ works with local governments and special districts addressing difficult financial issues facing municipal governments today. Russ has developed budget forecasting models, performed financial condition analysis, and evaluated fees and special tax districts for his city, county, and special districts clients. Prior to, prior to starting his own firm, Russ was a director for Public Financial Management, PFM, responsible for overseeing a range of services, including the development of long-range financial plans, ensuring sustainable financial health, and optimizing municipal performance. With that, Russ, welcome and thank you for teaching our class today. And it's off to you.
Great, thanks, Catherine. And let me share my screen here. Okay. So now you should be able to see the slideshow on the screen. So today we're going to talk about 3 things, rethinking budgets, cash flow, and reserves. And these are some things I've talked about in different forums over the last few months. So rather than, hopefully it's not just for some of you who've seen my other presentations, it's a little more than a rehash. I've tried to think, a little differently, evolve with what's happened with the COVID crisis, and also have some 5 specific, what I call rethinks of things I think we should think about doing differently as we move on with this crisis and our budgets over the next probably several years. But first, I thought I'd start with something that just in your downtime, before we get into the meat of all this craziness, are just podcasts that I'm going to say for when you're in your downtime. Here's some podcasts. You can look at these later or look at these now I'll say the revisionist history, Malcolm Gladwell, A Good Walk Spoiled, is about golf and property taxes in California. So it's actually pretty fascinating. TWIV, which is This Week in Virology, which is as nerdy as it sounds. But it's one that talks a lot about COVID right now, but I've really kind of enjoyed that as kind of a hearing from real people. So anyway, there's a couple more on there. Just I thought sometimes if you want to listen to something to get your mind off everything else going on. So today we're going to talk about the interconnections. So the budget, reserves, and cash flow. And one of the reasons I think that we need to talk about these is that the reaction time between the loss of revenue and the ability to reduce expenses has almost, all but been eliminated for many agencies. Some that are still primarily on property tax aren't facing the same kinds of issues right now, but you might, somewhat later. But those of you who are in jurisdictions where reserves and council is saying for the reserves, let's use our reserves first. And I've talked to several cities where that is the case, that you could get to a point very quickly where you're out of reserves, and then your cash flow becomes the lifeline between, do I have enough money to pay my bills? And if not, how do I get money? So I think there's this interconnection of these three that is always there to some extent, but I think that's just been compressed into something that is more there than it has been ever before. And you need to look all three together, I think, as you move forward this coming year. So first, we're going to talk about budgets and rethinking budgets. We're going to start with a few quotes. This is from the Los Angeles Daily News on May 11th, which I think is true, right? Predicting with certainty the revenues for the fiscal year 21 is all but impossible without knowledge of exactly when the impact of COVID-19 will subside, along with its related economic impact. And I think all those things remain up in the air. And we're not really asking the question, what if we don't get a virus, or what if the any kind of long-term ability to withstand the virus isn't there? Like, can you get it again and again and again? Things we don't know, but things that I think probably keep us up at night thinking about. The other thing I read across the New York Times are two quotes. The first one from Jerry Brown, our last governor. And this is what he said in his speech following his last budget. What is out there is darkness, uncertainty, decline, and recession. Very dark statement coming with the budget, but one that seems to be actually a little prescient now with what we're going for. And the other one is from Gavin Newsom's inaugural address. Even in a booming economy, there's a sense that things are not as predictable as they once were. And I think we all have that sense right now. And then what do we know? So this is a historical look back. This is a graphic I would use to talk about before this current recession, which started in February, to talk about that we're closer to the next recession. We're further away from the last recession. We're closer to the next one. And looking at this is the 10-year versus 2-year Treasury spread. And you can see any time that went negative or below negative, you get this inverted curve. That was a pretty good indicator a recession was coming. And we've been heading in that direction for a few years now and have been raising those flags. But I provide this really to say, what do we know? We're now in our 6th recession since 1980. So we know there's going to be recessions. We know there's going to be ups and downs in the economy. And I will say that what we do between those gray bars is what happens when we hit the next gray bar. So we have to take the time between recessions to prepare for the next recession. And maybe that is a standard finance director, finance person kind of thinking. But I think it's rational thinking for who we are, what we have to do, and the services, important services that the local governments provide in California. So budgeting, I said a new look in FY21. Your budget clearly is impacted by how willing are you to cut expenses versus how willing are you to use reserves, and what is your cash flow. And I think that budgets have to consider a broader range of possibilities. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But you have your revenue expectations, which I don't know how confident you feel about your revenue expectations that you just adopted, how much that's changing with what's going on now as we're kind of, the lockdown is kind of coming back, and everything's going up. Is that gonna, did you assume everything was over this summer? Did you assume it was gonna go on for the next year? I mean, what happened? What were your revenue expectations? And with that, what was your expense response? I did talk about in March, I had a webinar where it said, you needed to be working right then about your expense response to labor unions, because that can take a long time to make it through whatever hurdles you have to jump through to get. So hopefully, if you're a jurisdiction that was impacted by COVID revenue issues, then you're also one that jumped quickly on expense responses and preparing for those. And the last we'll talk about more as reserves, but what do you have in your reserves? How willing are you to use your reserves? I think, again, this is that compression of these different issues into the budget than we've had in the past several years. So rethink number one, in terms of you're looking at our budget. So one of the things I do professionally is budget forecasting. And oftentimes a criticism of budget forecasting is that on the revenue side, is that the revenues are generally, you're not going to criticize because you have too much money coming in. That's usually you're being too conservative coming in. That's not showing that you have the expanse to increase wages or do other kinds of things. But I'm going to say that now we really need to focus on expenses more than we need to focus on revenues, partly because the revenues are so in question of what's going to happen. So if many budgets were already over the edge. I mean, I've seen several budgets prior to COVID that could not, the expenses could not keep up with the revenues. And I think there's this hope that future revenue growth would be there to cover these growing costs. So now we have this crisis, and what are we putting in our budgets? I guess so what I'm saying partly in focus on expenses is let's stop leaving off the expenses we can't afford from our budgets. So deferred maintenance, streets, even with SB1, many jurisdictions are way underfunded on streets. I'll talk a little while about something that happened in the city of Oxnard in a proposal or from the something that's could be on the ballot this November for them to fund the streets by using their sales tax. Parks and playgrounds, buildings, too often cities don't even know what their costs in these areas are, let alone being able to talk about them. And oftentimes if they know, it's not being talked about when you put a budget, when you get it, what we might call a balanced budget. Retiree benefits, the buffer for PERS increases. A lot of cities did create these, and a lot of cities I'm talking to now are planning to using those during this COVID crisis. So those might be gone. But what's the full funding for OPEB? Also, the other thing just to think about, retiree playoffs. I think you could see, and I've heard in lots of cities, you're getting a spike in retirement as people are just ready to say, I don't want to deal with this anymore. And then community investments, right? So what are the things your community wants to do, and what do you need to keep investing in? So partly I'm just going to say focus on expenses, and I'll talk a little more about this, I think, in the next slide, but just broadly think about what do we need to fund and why. And here long term then, one thing I'm suggesting with this is that over here to the left, you set your base budget, you set your base budget to be able to absorb revenue shocks. So that means, what I think that means, and this gets back to what I said earlier, your base budget, which could be your salaries, services and supplies, and you have some long-term liabilities built in there, primarily PERS, because you've got to pay what PERS tells you to pay. So that's your base of what you're providing in regular services. And I'm saying we need to lower those as a % of our total expected revenues. So instead of salaries being in the 70 to 75. I've seen one city I did some work with, they're at 80, going to 90% of salaries as a % of budget, is to be down in a lower percentage realm. And I don't know if that is for you, services and supplies, and long-term liabilities that create an opportunity, especially during the good times, for investments in deferred maintenance and long-term liabilities and investments in the community. And then when you have something like a shock like what we have right now, you have both savings, which you could use if you had to, but you have a way of saying, we're going to pull back for now during this difficult time for funding those, but we're going to leave that room for when revenues come back, we'll continue funding those. So I say this, I think it's kind of self-evident in one sense, but another way people don't do it, right? I don't see many cities that are able to do this. And I think you're the ones that have to kind of carry that torch, even though you're not going to make you're not going to be the responsible for setting the decisions. It's, city manager or council who will lead, kind of that political way of how you look at it. But if you don't have if you don't propose a different structure, they're not going to see a different way. So I think it's going to start with us in terms of moving this forward.
Okay, Russ, I'm going to launch our first check-in question. So just to make sure people are still there. So if you please, if you would like your CPE certificate and credits. Wow, people are really fast in answering this question.
One person is not still here, I think. That's the person who doesn't need the CPEs.
Yeah, they're like, no. Wow. Okay, I'm going to give it another 6 seconds. So we're going to, all right. Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, going back to your slide. Thank you so much.
Okay, yep. All right, so to set your base, let's see the next one. Yeah, understand, I think, and talk about your current budget issues. Now, I use this example is one from a city I did some work with. We're going into pre-COVID, they had a significant issues with increased salaries and increased PERS, but also they balanced the previous year's budget, or this, FY20's budget, on one-time property sale revenue that they didn't have for this current year that we're in. And then they had some savings for the decrease in transfers out, but a small part of their fiscal issue was going to be COVID related at the time they at the time they were doing their budget. And yet the entire budget issues were blamed on COVID. And, from a political perspective, I understand that. But I think we need to tell the truth about where we are. I'll say the finance director in this case did tell the truth, and it wasn't her decision of how to spin the truth. So, but she did her job, and she, did what she needed to do. And so it doesn't always bear fruit, but I think these are important things to understand where you are, because you can only fix from where you are, not from where you'd like to be. And maybe this makes sense, but avoid unaffordable labor agreements. And so I'll say part of this in asking, can you afford this? This will get into the, a part of our discussion here shortly, which is going to talk about budget forecasts. And I show, this is 3 cities. The first on the left is city of Fremont. I picked Fremont partly because my sister's lieutenant, she works there. And we've talked about their situation. So I looked up what the raises they'd given, and over fiscal year 2021, 1920, they've given 8 to 12.5% to police and fire. Maybe they seemed affordable at the time, but now it's kind of probably something you wish you'd given something closer to CPI. And what I've heard, I don't know where they are, she just said they're now looking at maybe getting a 10% reduction, right? So that's that labor, that cost, and now it raises a lot of issues, right? If you have to take something away versus never giving something. SAC Fire is another one. They did 10% last December, which is a 5% retro and a 5% coming. This came right as we were doing an arbitration. They were getting ready for an arbitration hearing. They settled. This is something that, the city the city finance director was, said we can't afford it. I was doing some work for them, and we were just about to show them why you can't afford this, and they settled. And the other one is City of Watsonville, and this is actually from a published finding arbitration report. That, and this is, there's a little different throughout, but this is what the last best and final offers before going to arbitration. Fire is cresting 18.5%, along with the 10,000 in one-time payments. The city was offering, they offered over 2 years, 12%, which was a big move for them as well. The city did prevail, and so they, they have a lower amount than they would have had they just agreed to what the fire did. I'll say the other thing with the SAC fire, just looking at what they did, the recent side letter provides actually a 17% bump for participation, voluntary participation in a mobile integrated health program, which I thought was interesting. But to think about labor agreements beyond 1 year or 2 years, whatever they like, but to think of them in a longer term basis, because they live with you forever. And I'll give the example that I've given before, which is that in 2000, when you had the super funded Calpers, I kind of, we can wistfully remember back to Calpers super funded benefits, and people got a 35% bump in benefits if you went, say, from 2 at 55 to 2.7 at 55, and yet that is so much at the heart of what we're dealing with now. So things we decide now can have negative impacts decades later. And I think we just need to take a longer term view at things that aren't 1 year, 2 year expenses, but decade long expenses. And then unusual or hidden costs, liability insurance, increased payouts, especially for police, which seems to be driving this. Again, and I pick on Sacramento just because I'm close to Sacramento, but they went from 1.3 million in 2016 to 3.5 million in 2019. What's happening to your liability? Are people more likely to have issues in liability, or even workers' comp? We're not dealing with the whole thing of working from home, but that was always a big concern when I was in the city of Roseville. People working at home was, how do you account for their workspace and workers' comp insurance? General fund backed debt, right? If you have general fund backed debt for something you don't think of as the general fund, a golf course, a parking lot, or something else, but you might back that general fund, that could be a hidden cost this coming year, where you may have to step in and make some payments that you weren't planning on making. Same thing with governmental funds, like housing funds or engineering, or depending what your structure is, right, that are backed by the general fund. You may have to be stepping in. That may not be included in your budget at this time. I put in technical default. You don't see this a lot, but you did see this with one community I'd done some work with, which is they had a swap contract on a POB, and the city was downgraded, and that created, even though they had enough money to keep paying, it created a technical default on that bond, and they were able to, fortunately, restructure that with a different agency, but they had a very large negative mark to market, right? So again, not expecting to have something like that. You could see things like that if you have contracts where there's a technical default provision. You might see that triggered in these difficult economic times. And then special pays, and this is the thing that always bothers me about special pays, is if there's no limit on who can receive them, you can see costs going up and up in certain labor groups, irrespective of what you're giving them now in terms of COLA rate, COLAs. Even if the COLAs are flat, so ed incentives, cert pays for different things, longevity, etc. And this, that's especially on fire. This is where I found oftentimes fire. When I was City of Roseville, they'd proposed lots of cert pays and with no limits, and people could get 5, 10, 15% bumps if they just went to a few classes. So those are some other things to think about on the budget side. And I think that rethinking relationships, those interplays between revenues and reserves on one side and expenses on the other. If you look over here to the right, so this jurisdiction pre-recession was spending a lot of money on non-personnel costs. And then, like a lot of local jurisdictions, right, when when the Great Recession hit and you had less money, you started cutting costs. This is oftentimes a way to cut costs quickly in somewhat painlessly because you don't have to lay people off or not provide services. But here's what happened. I think a lot of places that they never went back up. So they went down, and then there's a demand for labor for if they lost anything or if they had a long period of no raises, they wanted that back, and that came back. And that left no room for these investments and other things that we needed to do. Again, hoping for that return to revenues, and for a lot of cities, that future didn't come. So what is the relationship between our revenues and our expenses, not just on a one-year basis, but on a long-term basis? And so I thought with that, I just throw in 6 things to keep you up at night. If all that isn't enough, this is just to talk about. I'll talk about each of these. The looming bank collapse, which is, if you read The Atlantic, you saw that this month. We'll talk 4 economic bubbles and public engagement. So let's just look quickly. You should read this article in The Atlantic. I give you kind of a reference there by what it's called, who wrote it, and it's in the July-August Atlantic magazine. But basically what you have is where CDOs, right? Collateralized debt obligations were big part of what brought down the economy during the Great Recession. You have now even a bigger tranches of CLOs, which are collateralized loan obligations, which are for businesses. And it's a fascinating article. It's not something I've really heard about or thought about, or that something in the back of my mind says that these were talked about at the end of The Big Short, that these were starting to come on. And I just heard something today on another podcast I listened to, The Indicator, NPR, The Indicator, which talked about student debt, which is, I think, our next one. Yeah, student debt. And student debt has also been repackaged and sold in these collateralized debt obligations, right? But student debt growth in 2010, there's $247 million outstanding current debt. 2020, it's $1.3 trillion. So this is one that hits close to me as someone with 2 kids in college. We're hoping to get them out without debt. We'll see. Over 10% of student debts are in default. And what's the impact of this on consumer spending, on individual credit, their ability to buy homes, cars, etc. for these kids? I guess they feel like kids. They're young adults who have graduated from college in the last 10 years with this kind of debt. That's a huge impact after decades of near zero debt. Really started about 25 years ago. Per capita healthcare costs. Our costs keep going up. Our healthcare outcomes are lower than almost all other major first world countries. And this is something, if you continue this 6% or so growth a year, I think we're going to see that, especially with COVID. We could see even higher growth on healthcare costs. This both limits employees who have to pay this, or if you're paying, depending what your deals are with your labor groups, it's going to impact your ability to pay for other things, right, on healthcare. Unfunded pension liabilities. This is one we know a lot about, right? And we have a lot of continued fear on. It's interesting. This is from the Calpers website. They kind of see this as, hey, we're doing pretty well. I have a different view on it, which is because it's not necessarily, even though it's kind of flattened out, I think we're going to see some, this is decreasing here in the next year. There is a Calpers webinar at 9 a.m. This is a Calpers, their webinar at 9 a.m. On July 21st. So that's something you should sign up for them to talk about their, I think, returns as of June 30, 2020. I said 2019, that is wrong. But so think about that. But Calpers funding, we're all expecting to go up. That will hit you in fiscal year 22. So that's something to follow on beyond the current crisis. Federal debt, I'm not a big federal, the federal debt has to get to zero, but I do think there's an issue that right prior to COVID, we had a major tax cut. which was going to increase the federal debt by about $1 trillion. We now have $1 trillion, in debt potentially with COVID impacts. And the question, really the question being, is there going to be a widening debt gap, right? So is that going to make, more and more, it's just going to exacerbate everything. Again, during the good times is when you should be paying down the debt. And that hasn't happened here recently. So it's just something to think about and look at. And the last, and this is something that affects a lot of you, which is I'll say public engagement. So I have two examples here. One is the defund the police movement. There's a question, what does that mean? I'll talk about that in the next slide a little bit more. But the other is like the city of Oxnard, and I did some work for them around this in December and January. Is there were 3 public initiatives. I'll talk about 2. One that said, look, if you don't increase your pavement condition index to 80, your local option sales tax needs to go away. And local option sales tax is a general tax that was used for lots of things, including a little on pavement. But the reality of this was for them to do this, to get to 80, which means they'd use 100% of their sales tax plus an equal amount of that from the general fund to fund that. So economically, it's not doable, but this is somebody in the community that's saying, look, you're not paying attention to this, so we're going to try to force this and give you an economic incentive to pay attention to streets over anything else. And the other thing they did, and there's a lot of history behind this that I won't get into, but what could be on the ballot, they're challenging this in court, but I don't think it's defined yet, so it could be on the ballot, is to designate the elected treasurer as the finance director, who would prepare the annual budget and present it to the city as opposed to the city manager, and would designate 3 performance metrics for each department. There's a lot involved in that. But again, this is a group of people that are saying, we don't like the way you're doing it, we want to take over. So this is, I think you're seeing this more and more, right? So that how you spend your money is becoming a mainstream and divisive topic, right? So what does this mean for how we define budgets? And I took a look here, and I wanted to look at 3 cities that I've had some interactions with. I did studies for Compton and Salinas. I worked for 14 years at the city of Roseville as finance director and assistant city manager. And so on the left is the kind of the absolute, and I should say in millions, I'm sorry, it's not 20, I forgot to add that on. So this is millions of dollars. City of Compton, and this is FY21. I actually had data for them from 2016. I had data from Salinas for 2018. So these are updated to their FY21 budgets. Compton pays about $22 million to a contract with LA Sheriff for their police. They don't have their own police department. You can see nothing shows up on Parks and Rec. And I looked at this and looked at this and looked at this. 4 years ago, they spent $2.5 million on Parks and Rec, which is virtually nothing for that community. In their FY21 budget, $100,000 is their budget for Parks and Rec. Wow. City of Salinas, they spend, $53 million for police, about 2.5, or I think they're at 4.4 million for Parks and Rec. And then Roseville, and I'll say spends, 45 million, 44 something on police, and about 27, 28 million on Parks and Rec. So as a percent of general fund budget, right? What you have is the wealthiest community, which is Roseville, spends the smallest percentage on police and the greatest percentage on Parks and Rec. Part of this is just the way revenue is distributed in California, and you have, higher property values, more sales tax. Roseville's been very successful about generating, kind of attracting taxable sales. But there's also a correlation between poverty and race here as well that I'm not going to get into a lot right now. But it's really, I'll say for me, the defund the police is starting to think about, well, they're not talking about Roseville, right? They're not talking about places that have this, I think, probably a reasonable balance between police and other services. But I think people are really talking out of the Compton and Salinas, saying we need to have more services and less policing. So I think it's something we're gonna have to pay attention to, and it's something that I think we should get ahead of and think about. And I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to solve this, but I think it's a real problem and something that's going to keep coming up in the near future.
Okay, Russ, can I stop
Yeah.
you for a sec? Let me
Yes.
do another polling question. Are you still here? We're going to have 30 seconds. I like the non-committal maybes.
Yeah, there you go. So, and I don't know if anybody wants to share if we're taking a minute break here, but maybe if someone has a thought of how is your jurisdiction, this is a polling question, but I'm curious if someone's willing to share if your jurisdiction is approaching budgeting differently because of COVID or because of social unrest.
Yeah, if you would like to share, you can put it in the Q&A and then we can unmute you, or you can, I'm sorry, you can raise your hand so we can unmute you, or you can even put it in the Q&A and say anonymous if that's, if you don't want to share which community you're from.
All right, so I'll leave that out there, but if you have things, please, you can please add to what you see here. So, a couple of things and talk about budget models. So this, budget modeling clearly relates to budgets and how we develop our budgets. One of the issues I found, I've had some resistance from people doing budget modeling. It's like, I mean, you don't really know if it's right or if it's true. It's the future, who knows? And this is from George Box, who's a British statistician, said all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that's for me, that's the key thing, which is, any forecast model is going to be wrong in the sense so they're not predictions, but they can be very useful in terms of being something that's, being something that you can test the structure of your budget and structural integrity of your budget.
So Russ, we do have one audience member that would like to share that it says council is having discussions, but we have yet to alter the budget as a result. We are just in the learning phase. So I'm thinking this has to do with the defunding of the police, maybe. So.
Yeah, and and probably so. And I know talking City of Oakland, I have a friend that works there. And I think the demand there is to defund by 50%, which is a difficult proposition in a place like in the city of Oakland because they have a high crime rates. The other thing is I do think that, and then one of the reasons I want to talk about this, I do think that this will evolve over this next year in terms of how we do this, and you might be redoing your budget here, right, within the next few months.
Okay, and then we have another audience members that says our budget modeling was based on slow reopening of community, but with the majority of California reclosing and taking a step or two backwards, I'm expecting we will be revisiting our forecast and monitoring everything closely.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, and I think especially I think that's true too, right? For all forecasts it's usually you do them once or twice a year. Now I think you're kind of every time you get some new information, you're redoing it.
Are you okay to take another comment from the audience?
Yeah.
Okay, and then we have somebody that says our organization is looking at a variety of policies that address Black Lives Matters and civil unrest, planning to do a study session in August. Not sure yet of the fiscal impact of these policies, still in development.
Okay, but I think that's what I think of there. It's a great point of how even though you're not at the policy level, right? I mean, you're obviously impacted by policies, but I think they're going to turn to finance people saying, okay, how can we do this? And so it's also goes into if you're talking about everything, throw everything in there, right? In terms of, so you're making all the choices, knowing all the information. This is another one which I like. I think often I attribute it to Niels Bohr, who's a mathematician. I threw it with mathematical. It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Yogi Berra is also somebody who said that, and anyway, I think that's very true. Okay, so rethink number 2 is on budget forecasts. And I'm going to, again, all full disclosure, this is partly what I do in my consulting practice, but I think budget forecasts should be required prior to adopting a budget. Partly to show impacts of, full impacts of expenses and revenues. I think to be able to stress test your revenues and your expenses. And I always throw in, what does it take to fully fund all of our liabilities? And to at least understand when you're making budget decisions, what you're doing or not doing. Budget forecasts should inform current year budget decisions. So that's the other piece is like, I think budget forecasts really aren't, again, that's the whole, it's difficult to predict the future. So budget forecast is really to say, what decisions are we making now that will have an impact on the future, and do we think we can live with the consequences of those actions? And budget forecasts should come with a policy plan. So I think that, how do you spend your limited resources? What do you do if revenues are higher or lower than anticipated? Especially that by including, hey, here's all of everything that's pressuring our budget. So it's salaries and it's all the, supplies and services, but it's also the deferred maintenance and the other, long-term liabilities. And to think about, okay, well, we can't fund all of those, but we can fund our labor and services and supplies. And if things get better from there, what do we do with that? I just have seen too many conversations, been involved in too many conversations where immediately labor runs in and says, hey, everything's better. We want this. And you definitely saw it. I wish at this point I would have thrown there's a slide that I've used before. It's just showing revenues going down, and then they start going up a little bit. So if, they're down 50%, they started going up 20%. And labor union is saying, all right, you're better. Everything's better. Revenues are back up. And we hadn't even recovered to pre-recession times. And so I think you'll see that again. So be prepared for that and to talk about that. But budget forecast should be, I think, a central part of any policy discussion, which that's what your budget is. It's the city's biggest and most important policy document. It's adopted every year. So we talk about forecasting is about today. I mean, so this is a similar kind of ideas, right? Identify the quantity of budget and quantify budget issues, look at all funding needs, inform policy decisions. And this, again, a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, the future depends on what we do in the present. So just that, getting back, this is all about today. It's all about what we do today and how that might impact our future. And then help council understand, their vulnerability. There's, the revenue volatility. I mean, everybody kind of understands that, but maybe you need to show them in terms of, where we think where we are, where it might go. Pensions, labor costs, health costs, reliance on new development. I think that's cut off by my threat assessment thing there. Unfunded liabilities and IT infrastructure. So one city I've done work with, they really can't afford it this year, but they have to invest $4.5 million of IT infrastructure because their system is falling apart. And so much of what we do now depends on IT working, right? Whether, especially now during the COVID-19 shelter in place, that your ability to get on the main computers and to take payments over online and all that, we've become more and more reliant on our IT infrastructure. And that's one we have to make sure we have enough money in our funding to continue keeping up to date. And then stressing the forecast, right? So what are rational alternatives? And this just looks at, I won't go into what these alternatives are, but just 4 different ways of looking at the budget in terms of how you approach what could be the blue bars here are the net revenue. The gray bars, the gray area is the fund balance. So you can see that most of these, that the city was having net revenue for quite a while, and then but there's some things they could do with that to kind of manage that over time and start bringing that curve back up. But to really emphasize, here's what we're doing now, and what's our plan to, we're planning to rerun the projection as new information becomes available, because this doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it does provide a way out, right? But again, we can't predict the future, so does what we think is supposed to happen happening? Is it better? Is it worse? Do we have to change directions? But again, it's about what the action we take now, based on what you think or how you think the future might unfold. All right, so at any time, here's another time, if anybody has any comments, questions, thoughts on budget forecasts. All right, so next we're going to talk about, oh, go ahead, yeah.
Let's do the number 3, the polling question number 3 right now. It's a good, all right, 30 seconds. Are you here? And yeah, if you have any comments or questions, you can use the Q&A function, and you can raise your hand. And then we would love to hear what you think, what challenges you're facing, or if you have any ideas that you would like to share. Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right.
All right, Russ.
Okay. So I think, all of us, this is a question we always ask, right? What should your reserves be? I guess a question maybe I have for you is now, not knowing that COVID was coming, are your reserves enough, right? So GFOA recommends a minimum 2 months, which is about 16.7%. In addition, that's their base level, right? That's the minimum you should have. And it's kind of highlighted over to the right, your fund balance should take into account each government's own unique circumstances. So that could be natural disasters, volatile revenue sources, limited ability to increase revenue. Just the limited ability to increase revenue in California. If you really need to change, it's a big process and education process you have to go through with your voters, and you hope they approve those votes. Also, savings for long-term obligations, fleet replacement capital, PERS, etc. And all the reserves need to be replaced when used, right? So as you're drawing down reserves now from whatever sources, you're going to have to build those back in, which is going to create ongoing stress in your budgets beyond the COVID crisis.
Now,
so,
Russ,
yeah.
There's a question, going back to your forecast, there's a question, how many years of forecast do you think should be required?
That's a good question. I would say at least, probably depending on how you want to do this, I like 5. Partly, I think 5 takes into account some sense of what we can know. The PERS, your PERS projections go out 5 years. There's a 5-year capital plan. So I think this 5-year thinking is kind of built into a lot of things where we already deal with. Okay. I've done 10-year forecasts, which I think are, I think they serve a little different purpose. They help to, see things on a longer-term basis, but I get less and less confident the further out I go. I did one 20-year forecast, which I thought, I don't know, I think of 2000 versus 2020, and it's a different world, right? So, but the purpose of that one was to look at, hey, do we have enough extra money to fund some debt from the general fund? So that was a valid reason to do that. I think 3 years is probably fine. I do like 5. Because I think you can see some issues there. I don't know if that's a should, but that's definitely my preference. And I think okay. What I like to do, but I do lots of time. I haven't done any 3s. So I figure if we can do a 3, you can probably, it's just, that's just more known. Anyway. Okay,
thank you.
Yeah. So wanted to look at, this is from one city, I think, which is just looking at it's actually City of Oakland, I'll say, because this is all public knowledge stuff. They have a 7.5% adopted policy reserve, which is, I think, very low for any city, but especially a city that size and with kind of vulnerabilities they have. but I just took a look at, they have the general fund, this is at 7.5%. They also have an additional vital services reserve on top of that. But if you look at the general fund revenue come from sales tax, TOT, and parking is nearly double that reserve level. And these are all very threatened and impacted revenues right now. So is your reserve enough, right? And to kind of look at that, judge your reserve against, hey, what could happen? And what happens if there's an earthquake? What happens if there's a fire? How will that impact the services we need to provide? And do we have enough? And this is always a really, fascinating conversation if you're in fact finding or labor negotiations or arbitration, that in terms of what's actually happening with your reserves, and why do you need them, and why can't you spend them on us, and right. So you've all had those kinds of conversations. The other thing is fund your reserve policy. So if you have a reserve policy, you should fund it. So this is a city that has a 15% minimum budget reserve, which would result about $26 million in your required reserve. Their general fund balance from the CAFR is a little over 19 million. But they also have $5.4 million of negative fund balances and other governmental funds that is covered by the general fund. And so they haven't balanced those out yet. But you'd say, well, really, your available fund balance is $12.2 million right now. And so going into the COVID crisis, they're probably going to need all of that 26 million to make things work, and they're around 12.2 million. So just really encourage you to fund your reserve policy and to make sure that's there. And some cities have been fantastic about this. Some counties are great about this, and some have struggled for various reasons. Usually that struggle is because the revenue side is always very stressed. So we talk about types of reserve, and I'll say the point, there's an economic reserve, there are these future cost reserves for fleet and IT and PERS and OPEB and maintenance and roads and parks and everything else. The point I'm trying to make here is on your economic reserves, what should your level be if you use them in a crisis to get to a balanced budget? Then you have to build back your reserves, right? So that's whatever you're drawing down, you're going to have to build back, which however long that takes you is going to stress your future budgets more and have less to recover with. And similar with future cost reserves, you say, we have money from fleet, we have money from IT, we have, OPEB trusts that we can maybe pay our current OPEB with, and maybe that's something you have to do, right? But you're going to figure out how much do I need. You hopefully use as prescribed, and then reassess the annual need and determine the funding need. So the more you use those, you're going to go backwards in terms of, just because you use your fleet replacement doesn't mean your fleet doesn't need to be replaced anymore, right? Unless you said, oh, we've overfunded that, that's a different story. PERS stabilization is meant to, it's meant to soften any kind of major increases in PERS. If you don't have that, you're going to have other bigger bumps coming alongside. And then again, excess cash, one-time monies, really, again, should be used for one-time expenses. And I know that most of us have the policy in our budget that one-time revenues are for one-time expenses. And I can't say how many times I see that violated because council doesn't always like, they want to give the raises or do something else, right? So to the extent you can keep that excess cash and pay off some of these, to pay back the reserves or to pay off some deferred liabilities that you haven't addressed is important.
Russ, there's there's a question. Would a disaster reserve be in addition to the economic reserve? Would it be based on some sort of assumption about a percentage of assets to be replaced and percentage of loss of revenue?
Yeah, I'll say yes. So I think with the GFOA, and let me go back up to that, is my understanding of, as I read the GFOA, is that your minimum, that 16.72 months operating reserve is a minimum, and then that reserve increases. And I see, based on if you have natural disasters or other things. And yeah, I think it would be based on what risk are we at in terms of our own infrastructure and what that cost to replace might be. I guess the less, you can may defer for FEMA or whatever else. I think there is a loss now, especially now, to think, boy, do we want a lost revenue reserve so we can replace some of that and not be caught in a situation we are now. I did some work with San Luis Obispo County a couple years ago, and one of the issues they're facing is the closure of Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. And the issue there is there's a loss of jobs and a loss of kind of economic, just economic activity in the county as those jobs go away. And it's a wealthy county. Maybe it doesn't have a huge impact, but it will have some impact. So how do we prepare for that? So I would say, I think that I see cities and counties do this both ways, have an economic reserve and then a kind of disaster reserve, partly because you want to have different criteria under which you use those. And I think either way is valid, however, however you conceptualize it. But I think it's just important to talk about what do we need this for, yeah. So, and I guess maybe this relates to this, right? So I think that use your reserves strategically, so for economic, calculate your long-term rebuilding as you use this, right? So think about the more we use, the more we have to put back. How does that, how long for COVID, how long is this gonna last? How deep is it gonna go? And then when it comes back, what are the issues when we come back to whatever the new normal is going to be? I know the issues I hear people talk about is closure of restaurants, closure of businesses. Again, going back to Oakland because of the social unrest, and there are a number of Target stores there that had to be boarded up. And my understanding is they may never come back in the city of downtown Oakland. And so you have those those kind of impacts from the social unrest and COVID closures. And so how are things going to come back? How much do you want to use now? What does that leave you for later? Stabilization reserves, again, show that impact. Rising pension costs, I think I'm really curious about what PERS is going to say on July 21st and what those impacts might be in FY22 and beyond. I saw a very disturbing article today because PERS is looking at selling debt to invest and take an arbitrage play on that, and I think it puts us all in a very risky position. Or puts Calpers in a very risky position, greater than they have been. So I think having the stabilization reserves are probably really smart if you have them. And if you don't have them, really show what the impact might be down the line. Future cost reserves, again, I've seen, again, before this crisis, all these things were happening where cities that maybe had reserves or didn't have enough reserve or hadn't put money aside or had spent that money that they put aside, don't have money to replace vehicles, right? Don't have money to replace fire trucks. And so Enterprise Rent-A-Car has been great at filling this void, and they come in and do this for them. But I think you get kind of stuck, right? It's hard to get out of that leasing cycle once you have that. And so maybe that's what they need to do. They're going to replace a soft savings with a hard contract. Maybe that's what has to happen for some communities too. And then again, excess cash we talked about. What else could it be used for? I just think strategically, and again, everyone's different how they do this. Councils are different how they see this and how they approach this. I've just been concerned recently with a couple larger cities where I've heard the political direction is spend down the reserves. I think it's hoping you're going to have the V recovery and everything will be fine in a few months. And I don't think any of us know what's going to happen at this point. Okay, so anytime, just throw in we can go back if you have other questions about reserves or thoughts or what your cities or county or agency is doing in reserves. It'd be great. So cash flow. Cash flow is an interesting one, I think, in terms of how I just feel like right now it's come into, as a bigger issue, right? As a bigger thing that you need to really think about your cash flow. even if you feel okay right now, I'd say have your cash flow model built. They're not necessarily difficult to build, but they're just, there's so many little things when you start building a cash flow model that you have to think about, which is exactly, when is this money going out, right? Because maybe we're not thinking about when do we have to pay the bills for the road we're building or the building we're building or whatever contracts we have. I think the simplest one is when do we have to pay Calpers, when do we have to pay health, when do we pay, salaries, we kind of know all that. But what happens when you have these unusual payments that are coming in? So this little flow chart that I put in is just say, does your budget show positive net revenue? I mean, if it does, okay, that's pretty good over time then, right? Over the year, we think, yeah, we have enough net revenue to make this work. If you don't have enough, if you're going to be negative, right? Well, that's a red flag, of course. And so then the question is, let's go on the red flag one. If you're negative, how low will your reserve go to fund a negative net revenue? And I think that's a huge question right now, right? If you're already coming in negative, and COVID's making you more negative, based on some assumptions that everything is going to be okay in the fall. Well, now it seems like maybe it's not going to be okay in the fall. If you go through, again, if you go through that, if your reserve fund is maybe after you get positive, you have more than 10% left in your reserves. Okay, so maybe you're fine. And where's there, so then you look at where's the risk in your revenue sources. But if you maybe go below 10% or below 5% or whatever that level is for you, are you in the process of reducing costs, or are you in the process of finding some additional revenue, looking under your mattress or wherever else you might find it? Again, if you look at your budget, you say, yeah, we're great, our revenue are solid, our revenue sources are solid, then you have no concerns. Then you have to know, do you have enough reserves or pooled cash to float any short-term fund cash flows, right? Because that's where we usually, if you're doing pooled cash, and you have lots of other governmental funds or enterprise funds, you can be fine, right? If you know that you have enough money at the end of the year, you don't even think about the kind of the little internal loans that happen, just because you're using pooled cash and maybe your general fund is negative for a time, but then your property tax comes in, you're fine. But if you have highly volatile revenue, then I think you really do need to continue looking at your cash flow based on changes in sales tax and TOT, or again, if you have parking funds or other kinds of funds like that could be draws in your general fund, to look at those and to look at, do we need trans? Do we have a letter of credit? How do we deal with this? What if we don't have lots of enterprise funds with lots of money? There's lots of, all those little things you have to think about. But I do think cash flow is a bigger issue this year than it is in most years for most cities.
Okay. Russ, there's a question.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, and then I'm going to launch the polling question at the same time. Okay, let me read you the question. Our city is more dependent upon property tax and building revenues than sales tax revenue. As such, the impact of COVID-19 had minimal impact on our 2021 budget. Do you have any thoughts on how property tax and building revenues might be impacted in fiscal year 21-22?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know if I do, because I keep thinking, well, maybe the real estate market's going to crash, and I don't think it is right now. And I think there's still, maybe that's because so much of the unemployment has happened, to folks who are lower socioeconomic range. And so those of us who have jobs and can still work from home are fine and, doing things. And so I don't have a sense of what's going to happen there. On the building side, again, I think if people had money in process, they're still going forward. But I do know of projects that are, if their capital wasn't locked down, it's difficult to get capital right now. So, one of the things I mentioned earlier is other kind of impact issues from COVID. One of them I've heard from cities that have a lot of commercial office space. is that as people get used to being home, they they think, well, why do I need to go to the office? And there's a concern that you're going to see a lot of vacancies in commercial office space. My next door neighbor sells refrigeration equipment, and he was working these big deals with Apple and Google, and they've all said, hold on, we don't know if we're going to build more office space, right? Because we think people can work at home. We can save a lot of money. So I think that could impact some cities. Calpers, I think you will see some kind of increase. Maybe we'll hear a little more of that on July 21st. But I think those costs could go up. But if you're not heavily dependent on sales tax and TOT, you're definitely in a better position to kind of wait and see. I personally don't have any crystal ball. And I listened by going back to my TWIV, which my family makes fun of me for talking about this, my This Week in Virology podcast. One of the things they said, which was very true, which was that if you go to see a doctor about COVID-19 and they don't say 2 or 3 times in discussion, I don't know, get a new doctor. So I think we're in that situation. We don't know. But that's a great question. That is the question, right? What's going to happen? I'll say the other question you might ask though is on property tax, depending what county you're in, is that are you talking to your county about how their collections are? Because if you're teetered and you're used to getting 100%, oftentimes counties have policies. Now they may not trickle till next year, but they could have policies of, hey, if we get to 3% delinquencies, then we can stop teeter. So how on top of your county on collections, and is there any possibility that you could go off of teeter and then have to take less money now than, I guess technically you get taxes, you get interest and penalties, but I think those are waived for this next year by the governor. So then you're just stuck with no more revenue. So that's definitely something to think about as well, or at least talk to your county tax collector about what's going on. How are they doing? What is their policy? Is there some ability for them to go off of teeter if this continues on? Okay, so step one was just looking at the big picture, identify how big of a problem could I have, how important is this? I think step two, this is the basics of a cash flow, right? Expected revenues, how much cash you're starting with, which is not necessarily fund balance, right? This is actually what cash do you have access to, not what cash, does Catherine or someone from May say you have because it's in your fund balance, right? What do I have access to? Expected revenue by month, right? And what will this be, and when do those costs come in? And then if you have any other potential revenues that you can use. Expenses by month, remember to add in MOU increases if they're built in already to MOUs that are still going forward. And include transfers outside funds. So again, think about, are there expenses we think are going to come, especially for whoever asked the question about, hey, are property taxes and building fees and other kind of user charges, if this does go on for some period of time and you see a big fall off on those, which people I've talked to haven't seen a huge fall off, but if you start seeing a fall off, then either you have to deal with the cost in those departments, or you're going to see to need to infuse revenue from somewhere. And then if you do have negative, just to be able to have time to figure that out. That's really the reason, a big reason to do this is so as far in advance as possible, hey, we may have a problem here, and at least get set up for whatever kind of, do you qualify? Can you access the market, whether that's a bank loan or a TRAN or something else? Can you access the market to get money if you don't have that internally? And if you don't, then you got to cut costs. So step three, so I think is, evaluate all potential calls in general fund. I've already talked about this, so I won't necessarily spend a lot of time, but, again, debt service, contract changes, so whether it's MOUs, built-in escalators to contracts, health insurance, PERS rate increases. There's a city I worked with that had a repayment kind of a settlement agreement that has been steadily going down, right? So it's part of the agreement. So it's known, but you have to say, oh, remember, oh yeah, this is the year that payment drops $3 million, and we have $3 million left, and in 4 more years it drops, goes down to 0, right? So those are the kinds of contract things you want to think about and remember. And then, development funds we just talked about, user-based services, other general fund subsidies and services. How are those working? Are you getting the money in? Are you not? Is there, can you adjust your costs? Can't you adjust your costs? Are all questions to ask. And step 4, revenues, right? So TOT, sales tax, UT, property tax. Again, we think probably not until FY22. And I just have no sense. My guess is it'd also probably be regional, right? In terms of where there are issues with property taxes or not. Talked about teeter already. Talked about user charges and other revenue options. One option is if you have a trust, you can use your OPEB trust generally to pay your pay-go, right? So if that's a authorized use, you can't draw it out for some other purposes, but you can use it to at least pay your pay-go charges if you need to do that. So that's something to think about in your cash flow. So rethink number 4 is that using cash flow as a strategic tool during the crisis. If there's not enough cash before the next revenue infusion, you have to strategize how you use that gap. So it's really just using it as a strategic issue. And I say if you don't have enough cash, period, then you should panic. It's not, I would panic, but don't get to this point, right? So that's the primary goal of doing a cash flow is you don't look at one day and you don't have enough money to pay your, to pay your cash. You especially don't want to figure that out if you've sent out checks to your employees and they say, wait, bank says this is no good. That's not a good place to be. So common pitfalls with the cash flow, I think one, getting lost in the data. I was talking to somebody doing work for their city, and it didn't happen, but one of the issues they had was, well, our treasurer says that they need to hire 4 people and this could take, 6 months to do our cash flow. And he's like, well, that's not going to work. So don't get lost in the data. You can get to like I think a 95% confidence level without having everything nailed down exactly. Just the uncertainty of revenue or expenses on a monthly basis is something you have to contend with and think about. Not updating as data changes. So you find out, I think, we're going to be coming up here in August with SBOE sales tax information and what that past has been, and that's going to help you figure out the future and help your sales tax consultants, figure out what your, changes to your cash flow and probably projections are going to be. TOT and what's happening with that, something I've heard said a lot, but just, I think having regular conversations with your major hotels and trying to figure out what's going on with TOT, especially if you're, engaged in that. I haven't looked recently at what's going on with places like, Anaheim or, San Francisco has said, they're looking at big drops because they're big TOT areas. There's one city that 75% of the revenue, small city, but they're very tourist based, 75% of the revenue is sales tax and TOT. They're in trouble, so then it's like, we better do a cash flow. How do we get this thing going? I think that during stable times, you might use this as a checks box once a year. But for now, it's not a stable time. You just have to do it and don't let it, don't let it go undone. Not communicating cash flow needs to the departments who have outside contracts. So sometimes you do have to talk to the, contracts that are going on or coming forward. You talk to the department, say, hey, what do you have coming on and when, to figure out your cash flows. That's a data issue, which gets into lack of awareness of planned spending or lack of control of spending on existing contracts, right? Change order process. I mean, I'll say when I was in Roseville, 2 instances of stuff where it's like, oh my God. One was we had a $4 million public works project that all of a sudden was $8 million before I knew about it. Maybe I should have been watching better, but it's like you're sitting there saying, fortunately we had the money, but I don't know what we would have done if we didn't have the money, right? Because the money was spent. And another time, change orders to the library was several $1 million over. because they didn't know how to properly manage their change orders. And by the time that's done, it's you don't know about when it's happening. So try to touch base with those folks who are doing contracts, look at where they are and any kind of issues you might expect. And how often do you update? I think really anytime there's a new sales pact reductions or TOT doesn't make expectations. If you have labor negotiations, I think you want to do that if you're going to, if something comes up. And then prior to community large commitments. I think that this is a time to think about cash flow in a different way than you have before. So cash flow is one, I don't know if there's any questions or comments, or if people are running into, learning new things because of cash flow. But, again, if you're stable, not as big of a deal, but if you have high volatility, I think it's a big deal to look at.
So Russ, let me launch this question. I actually have a question for, I'm going to launch this poll, and can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So based on your experience in Roseville about just the communication with the departments and stuff, how did you do it differently after those two instances?
Well, yeah, so what we did differently, one was that we instituted, let's say on the one with the library change orders, we instituted different contracts, a different kind of contracting where where you couldn't just do change orders without having a bigger approval process and going through and updating when there's a change order, updating the total budget and making sure it's within the range. On the public works one, someone just screwed up. And I mean, it kind of is the same kind of as a contract. That wasn't even a contract issue. That was a staffing issue if they just weren't paying attention. So I think, again, that was early 2000s. We did get better, better computer tracking. But that was a bigger issue before you really had good computer tracking. And, you figured it out as the bills came in. You're saying, wait a second, this is a lot more, you got a big bill. This is a lot more than we've authorized.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, there's another question. Let's see. What kind of system are you using to track contract cash flow, especially long-term contracts? Do you use Excel or a forecasting budget tools?
Oh, for long-term to capture. Well, I'll go for budget forecast. Use Excel. When I was in the city of Roseville, what we used was we just tracked it better within our account. We had a module within our accounting system where we had here's the top, what's authorized. We also did do some things of sometimes authorizing a little more for contingencies along with that. But that was just, we had people within our office who started then tracking the contracts better and having more direct communication with other departments in terms of those contracts and conversations around change orders. So we did kind of it was partly tracking within our system and partly tracking with matching staff members to the main project managers.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So we're almost done. So my rethink number 5 is redefine your responsibility. And so this is don't let short-term thinking cloud the information you provide. And I'll say as I in thinking about this, and here's what I'm saying, and I guess what I'm asking or suggesting that you do is really go out there with a more long-term thinking about what is your organization's longer-term goals, what are your longer-term revenues and expenses, and present that. And so that means, hey, here's the stuff we're not funding that we should be funding, right? So I'm just, I'm going to put a new roof on my house, and I don't have, the $25,000 sitting around to do that. So I have to go get a loan to do that. So that's okay, but do you have the capacity to get a loan? Do you want do you want to get a loan, or should you be putting that money aside, right? So either way, you have to account for that in terms of your cash flow and what you want to do as an organization. So think about that and build that into what you're doing. So I think, just short-term thinking results in just looking at your agency only as a 1 or 2 year going concern. Now that's what Catherine and her team have to do, right? They have to look at your going concern here for the next 12 to 18 months. And that's great for an audit, but I think that's not great for the organization, as if you're responsible for the health of this organization over a long period of time. And then don't tell, it results in oftentimes telling part of the story. It just drove me crazy. And this is not what I control, but it drove me crazy when we'd say we could afford, an increase in fill in the blank for the labor union, usually fire, police, contract, but we only calculated the cost during the current contract. And and everybody kind of figured out, well, if we put an increase in on the last day of the contract, that's zero cost, right? It's not zero cost. So that's short-term thinking, as opposed to saying, hey, here's how this fits in over a 5-year or longer period. And to saying you have a balanced budget because you can pay your bills this year when you're really getting further and further behind in other things. So I say know the long-term story of your agency's financial position and present that story, even if it's, that can be a really hard thing to do depending on what the politics of your community are. So, that's where you just have to live, but I think you have to at least understand it and try to get those statements out there. You may or may not be listened to, but I think that's what your responsibility is. Then, and we're not going to spend a lot of time going through these, but you have these, just a lot of tools and resources. I think whether it's for forecasting, everyone knows Michael Coleman's website, other tools at Government Finance Officers Association, ICMA, League of Cities have a lot of tools and resources for coronavirus. Again, GFOA has a lot of stuff, including GFOA has a number of templates you can download for cash flow or other things of that nature. So that's just something to, they're there for you. If you may or may not know all those resources, but this is a tough time, and we can all use all the help we can get to do this. So that's the end of my presentation. Be happy to answer any more questions, and really thank you for your time with me this afternoon.
Hold on. I'm going to launch one more polling question, and then I think we have a few questions. So Russ, you mentioned that there's a Calpers webinar on the July 21st. Can you share the link for on how to register for the webinar?
I don't. Yeah, I can. But if you just go to Calpers, let's see. Let me look. Okay. Because I registered, but I don't know if that's. I don't know if it's. I will share. I'll look at it and show you the link I have, Catherine, afterwards. You can send it out.
Okay.
But
yeah.
If you go to Calpers, I think they had it. They have it. It just came out last week. I think they've been having trouble figuring out how to do it. So. Okay.
And then is there contact information on your site somewhere? If people have more questions, how can they contact you?
Well, that's a great wow. Okay. That's one thing I didn't do at all.
You selflessly taught the class. So what if they wanted more information from you?
That's right. I'll just say russ@russbransonconsulting.com.
Okay. And what kind of consulting services are you doing right now?
I do consulting service. So I do, again, budget forecasting, which I did talk about. I've done some fee analysis. I'm doing some LRCFD analysis. I do financial condition analysis, especially for labor. And I've done arbitration and fact-finding testimonies. And so kind of the things in all that kind of realm of consulting.
Okay, well, if you have any questions or need any help, please look us Russ. And if there's any more questions, that you can reach Russ directly, or you can email us. And thank you very much for your time today. And thank you, Russ, for helping us out today.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to do it.
All right. Take care, everybody. See you on Wednesday. Bye.